Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, here's a quick rundown on what this show is all about. Here on the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Our decks are built using a $25 budget, that's $25 for 100 cards. Prices on the show are powered by our sponsor TCG Player. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can stay updated on the latest Commander's Quarters deck techs. Today's commander is going to be Trostani Discordant. Trostani is a 1/4 Dryad that costs 3 green-white. She has other creatures you control get +1/+1, and when she enters the battlefield, you get to create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. She also has at the beginning of your end step, each player gains control of all creatures they own. Now for this deck, we're going to focus on her first 2 abilities. She's going to provide us with an Anthem effect with that +1/+1, so she makes those soldiers bigger. And if we can abuse that enter the battlefield effect, we can create a huge army. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we're going to use Flicker and Blink effects to create an army of soldiers. Every single time that Trostani enters the battlefield, we're going to get 2 more soldiers. But we're also running some other creatures that have some similar effects. So how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to pump up our entire team and run over the opposition. So not only do we have Trostani as an Anthem effect, but we're also running a lot of other cards that pump up our creatures. This deck can go wide and tall, making it a huge threat to our opponents. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's go into tactic number 1, Oh the Places You'll Go. Avacyn's Pilgrim can come down on turn 1 and tap for a white. Then we've got Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which are going to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Rampant Growth can do any basic land, and Farseek is limited to just plains. Then there's Sakura Tribe Elder, Dawn Trader Elk, and Diligent Farmhand, each of which can sacrifice themselves to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up, we've got Elvish Rejuvenator, Wood Elves, and Farhaven Elf, each of which, when they enter the battlefield, will get a land and put into play tapped. But Elvish Rejuvenator is limited to just the top 5 cards of our library, and Wood Elves can only get us a forest. And then there's Fertilated, which enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. We can pay 1 and a green to remove one of those +1/+1 counters and search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. A lot of our ramp in this deck is creature-based. The reasoning for this is that we have a lot of Anthem effects, so later in the game, these creatures can even be a threat too. Alright, enough talking about ramp though, let's go into tactic number 2, Follow the Leader. We're going to be running a couple of other creatures that mimic Trostani's Enter the Battlefield trigger. When Cloud Goat Ranger enters the battlefield, we're going to put 3 1/1 white Kithkin soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield. And then when Evangel of Heliod enters the battlefield, we get to put a number of 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield equal to our devotion to white. At the very least, this is going to be 2 soldiers, and it can be upwards of 10 with this deck. So at certain times of the game, it can be even more beneficial to us to either flicker or blink these guys instead of Trostani. Next up is going to be Captain of the Watch, which when it comes into play, we get to put 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield. On top of that, she's also going to give other soldier creatures we control +1/+1 and Vigilance. Now while this card is amazing in this deck, it's not quite as good as our next card coming up. The golden pig for this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99, is Knight Captain of Eos. Knight Captain of Eos is a 2/2 human knight that costs 4 and a white. When it enters the battlefield, we get to put 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens into play. And then at any time, we can pay a white to sacrifice a soldier to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. So with this guy in play, at any time, we pretty much have a fog available. We have plenty of soldiers that we can sacrifice with all of our Enter the Battlefield triggers and with all of our Flicker and Blink effects. Since many decks are combat based in Commander, this guy comes in huge. And if he's not dealt with, he can pretty much just shut down the majority of our opponent's decks. We can even use him politically to gain favor with some of our opponents. If one of our opponents is swinging at another, we can offer to sacrifice one of our soldiers to prevent that damage that's going to be dealt to them. This can make combat very tricky for our opponents. This card is very flexible, and it's very hard for a lot of our opponents to work around. Even though it's one of the more pricier cards in the deck, it's well worth the cost. Next up is Geist Honored Monk, who can be a huge threat in itself. When it enters the battlefield, we may not get soldier tokens, but we get 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. And these flyers can come in huge for us throughout the game, both offensively and defensively. On top of that, Geist Honored Monk is a big threat in itself. Not only does it have vigilance, but it also has the power and toughness equal to the number of creatures that we control. With the amount of tokens that we can create in this deck, this card can get out of control very quickly. So we've talked about other cards with great Enter the Battlefield effects, but how do we abuse those effects? Let's go through some of those ways in tactic number 3, Not Fade Away. So just a quick note, there are 2 different ways that we exile and return a creature. One is known as a Blink effect, which means that we exile the creature and return them immediately. And the other is a Flicker effect, which means that we exile the creature and return to the battlefield at the end of the turn. So we're going to be running cards like Cloud Shift and Flicker, which will blink a creature, returning them to the battlefield immediately. And then a card like Liberate's going to flicker one of our creatures, which will return to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Then we've got Long Road Home and Otherworldly Journey, both of which do the exact same thing. They're going to flicker one of our creatures, and when it comes back into play, it's going to come into play with a +1/+1 counter on it. Next up is Acrobatic Maneuver, which is going to blink one of our creatures, and we get to draw a card. So we get some utility as well as that Enter the Battlefield trigger. Then there's Voyager Staff, which is an artifact that costs 1, and we can pay 2 to sacrifice it at any point to flicker one of our creatures. Next up is Synod Sanctum and Cold Storage, both of which we have to be careful with when we're using. With Synod Sanctum, we can pay 2 to tap it and exile a permanent that we control. Then at any point we can pay 2 to sacrifice it and return all cards that are exiled and put them back into play. Cold Storage is very similar, we pay 3 to exile a creature that we control. And then anytime we can sacrifice it to put all creature cards exiled with it back into play. The downside of these cards though are if someone destroys them and we can't sacrifice them in response, we're going to be in big trouble. Because every card that they exiled is going to be permanently exiled. As long as we play it safe though, these cards can be huge for us in helping save some of our creatures from board wipes and also helping us have some really huge turns. Next up we've got some Flicker and Blink effects built on some creatures. Flicker Wisp and Glimmerpoint Snag both flicker one of our creatures when they come into play. And then Felidar Guardian gets to blink a creature when it comes into play too. Having these abilities on a body can be huge for this deck. Again, we're running a ton of Anthem effects with this deck, so these guys can be huge later on in the game. Finally, we're running Vizier of Deferment, which is a very flexible card for this deck. It can be used either offensively or defensively for us. If we want another one of our Enter the Battlefield triggers, we just have to attack or block with one of our creatures and then flash in Vizier of Deferment. Or we can flash it in to remove one of our opponent's attacking creatures too. Now all these Blink and Flicker abilities are great, but we only get one use out of them. Let's see some multi-use effects in tactic number 4, Here to Stay and Go. Gale Powder Mage is a 3/3 flyer, and whenever it attacks, we can flicker another target creature. We can use this in a variety of different ways. We can either remove one of our opponent's blockers, or we can flicker one of our Enter the Battlefield effects. Then we've got Skybind, which is an enchantment that has Constellation. When Skybind or another enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, we can flicker another target non-enchantment permanent. Since we're running a good amount of enchantments, we can get a lot of value out of this throughout the game. One of those enchantments is going to be Flicker Form. When Flicker Form is attached to one of our creatures, we can flicker that creature at any point by just paying 2 white. We can get a ton of value out of this by just using that extra mana that we have lying around. Alright, so we've talked about creating an army with Enter the Battlefield triggers and Flicker and Blink effects, but how do we keep that army alive? Let's see some ways in tactic number 5, Stand Together. First up, we've got Eerie Interlude, which is an instant that's going to let us exile any number of target creatures that we control. Then we're going to return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Not only is this card great at helping us avoid wraths for our non-token creatures, but it's also great at helping us get some more Enter the Battlefield triggers. We also have some ways that protect our tokens too though. Root Boar Defenses is going to give all of our creatures indestructible until the end of the turn, and it's going to let us populate so we can create another soldier token. And then Make a Stand is also going to give all of our creatures indestructible, and it's going to give them +1/+0 until the end of the turn. This +1/+0 might not seem like much, but it can make a difference when you have a huge army. Finally, we're going to be running Dauntless Escort, which can protect our team on its own. When it's on the battlefield at any time, we can sacrifice it to give all of our creatures indestructible until the end of the turn. On top of that, it's a soldier, so it synergizes with some of the Anthem effects in this deck. Again, I've mentioned that we're running a lot of Anthem effects to pump up our entire team. Let's first go through some of the more specific ones in tactic number 6, for the few. Intangible Virtue is an enchantment that's going to give our creature tokens +1/+1 and Vigilance. And then there's Phantom General, which is a creature itself, but it's going to give all of our creature tokens +1/+1. Next up is Honor the Pure, Crusade, and Hall of Triumph, each of which will give all of our white creatures +1/+1. Next up we've got some creatures that do the exact same thing with Paragon of New Dawns and Celestial Crusader. Paragon of the New Dawns can give one of our white creatures Vigilance until the end of the turn. And Celestial Crusader has Flash and Split Second, so we can put it into play at any time. And finally there's Veteran Swordsmith, which gives all of our other soldier creatures +1/+0. The majority of creatures that we'll have on the battlefield are going to be those soldier creature tokens, and they benefit from all of these anthems. But there are some anthems in this deck that benefit all of our creatures, so let's go through them now in tactic number 7, for the many. Gaia's Anthem, Glorious Anthem, and Spear of Heliod each give all of our creatures +1/+1. On top of that, with Spear of Heliod, we can pay 1 white to tap it and destroy a target creature that dealt damage to us this turn. Then there's Kong Ming Sleeping Dragon, which is an anthem effect in himself. He's going to give all of our other creatures +1/+1. Next up is Dictative Heliod, which is going to pump all of our creatures by +2/+2. On top of that, it also has Flash, so we can cast it at any time for Little Combat Trick. And finally, there's our biggest anthem with Collective Blessing. While it does cost us 6 to get out, it's going to give all of our creatures +3/+3. So even with just this and our commander out, all of our soldiers are going to be 5/5s. And then anytime we flicker or blink Trostani, it's going to give us 2 more 5/5s for a total of 10 lifelinking power. But we can use our powerful army in ways outside of combat. Let's go through some of those ways in tactic number 8, Drawn to Life. Elemental Bond is an enchantment that says whenever a creature we control with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield, we draw a card. Now while our commander only creates soldiers that have 2 power to start off with, if we have one more anthem effect, it's going to trigger this twice. That means anytime that Trostani comes into play, we're going to draw 2 cards off of those soldiers. Then we're running Mouth to Feed. By casting Mouth, we're going to create a 3/3 Hippo creature token. And then Feed has Aftermath, so we can cast it from the graveyard, and it's going to let us draw a card for each creature we control with power 3 or greater. So again, we're not going to cast this until we're set up with enough anthem effects, but once we do, we can draw a ton of cards. Next up, we've got Collective Unconscious, Shamanic Revelation, and Camaraderie. Each of them are going to draw us a card for each creature that we control. On top of that, Shamanic Revelation is going to gain us 4 life for each creature that we control with power 4 or greater. And Camaraderie is going to gain us 1 life for each creature we control and give all of our creatures +1/+1 until the end of the turn. These are all very powerful cards in this deck since we'll have a ton of creature tokens in play. Next up is Harmonize, which is just a very good draw spell in its own right. For just 4 mana, it's going to draw us 3 cards. Then there's Path of Discovery, which is an enchantment. It has whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, it explores. So when a creature explores, we get to reveal the top card of our library. If it's a land card, we get to put into our hand. And if it's not, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature and then put that card either back on top of our library or into our graveyard. With all of our tokens coming into play, we're going to get a ton of triggers off of this. Finally, we've got Well of Lost Dreams and Dawn of Hope, both of which will draw us cards whenever we gain life. With Well of Lost Dreams, whenever we gain life, we can pay X where X is less than or equal to the amount of life that we gained and then draw X cards. And then with Dawn of Hope, whenever we gain life, we can pay 2 to draw a card. We can also pay 3 and a white to create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. With all of our lifelinking creature tokens that Trostani creates, we're going to gain a ton of life with this deck. And these cards just help turn that life gain into some additional value with drawing. Alright, so we've talked about our game plan, but let's talk about disturbing our opponent's game plan. It's time to go into tactic number 9, breaking things. First up, we got Sundering Growth, which is going to let us destroy target artifact or enchantment, and then we populate. Again, populating can come in huge with this deck. We might just be copying a 1/1 token, but with all of our Anthem effects, that token can get huge. And then there's Reclamation Sage, which when it comes into play, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And Acidic Slime does the exact same thing, but it also has Death Touch, and we can destroy land instead. With all the flickering and blinking effects with this deck, we can get multiple triggers from these guys if we need to. Alright, so we've talked about building up our giant army, but sometimes we need just a little more help to finish off our opponents. Let's go through some of those ways in tactic number 10, run them over. Overrun is a sorcery that's going to give all of our creatures +3/+3 and trample until the end of the turn. Now this is a great finisher, but this next card does it even better. That card is Overwhelming Stampede, which is going to give all of our creatures trample and +X/+X till the end of the turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures that we control. With all the Anthem effects that we have in this deck, there are plenty of times that we have a giant creature in play. If we cast Overwhelming Stampede at the right time, we can even finish off all of our opponents at once. But now that we've gone through all the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. We're going to be running 36 lands in this deck, including Elfane Palace, Tranquil Expanse, Selesnya Guildgate, Blossoming Sands, and Grey Pelt Refuge. Each of those are going to enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a white or a green. And on top of that, Blossoming Sands and Grey Pelt Refuge will each gain us a life when they come into play. Then there's Selesnya Sanctuary, which comes into play tapped, and it's going to make us return a land back to our hand. But for that price, we get a land that can tap for a green and a white. Then we're running Bant and Naya Panorama, each of which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice them to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up is Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, each of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Then there's Grasslands, which enters the battlefield tapped, but when it untaps, we can tap to sacrifice it to search our library for a forest or a plains and put into play tapped. Next up is Crows and Verge, which enters the battlefield tapped and can tap for a colorless. We can also pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a forest and a plains and put them into play tapped. We can either tap Blighted Woodland for a colorless, or we can pay 3 and a green to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for 2 basic lands and put them into play tapped. Next up is Mossport Bridge, which is a hideaway land. When it comes into play, we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library, exile one of them face down, and put the rest in the bottom of our library. Then if we control creatures with a total power of 10 or greater, we can pay a green to tap and play that card. Finally, we're going to be running 22 basic lands with this deck. 14 of those will be a plains, and 8 will be a forest. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that deck costs are calculated using TCG player optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Trostani Discordant EDH Rec deck is going to set you back $341.70. Let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $24.99. Again, each and every single Commander's Quarters deck is built to be tuned and focused within that $25 budget, but there are always ways to improve. Let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up is Panharmonicon, which is going to cost you $3.99. Panharmonicon is an artifact that costs 4, and it says, if an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So basically with this card in play, it's going to double up every single one of our enter the battlefield triggers. With this deck, this can get out of hand really quickly and help us build a giant army. Then there's Anointed Procession, which costs $5.80. It's an enchantment that costs 3 and a white, and it says, if an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. This is just another great way to help us build up our army really quickly. Next up is Conjurer's Closet, which costs $2.31. Conjurer's Closet is an artifact that costs 5, and it says, at the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control and then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So this card just basically gives us a free enter the battlefield trigger at the beginning of each end step. Then there's Ghostway, which comes in at $7.48. Ghostway is an instant that costs 2 and a white, and it's going to exile all creatures that we control and then return those creatures to play under their owner's control at the end of the turn. This is just another great way to get a ton of enter the battlefield effects, and it can also be used to save our team from a wrath. Next up is Cathar's Crusade, which is going to cost you $2.68. It's an enchantment that costs 3 white, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This card can pump up our team very quickly. And finally, there's Champion of Lamholt, which costs $1.49. It's a 1/1 human warrior that costs 1 green. It has creatures with power less than Champion of Lamholt's power can't block creatures you control. And then when another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lamholt. This is a great finisher in our deck and helps us finish off our opponents by not allowing them to block our creatures. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you're using that TCG Player link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you'll also be supporting the show because they sponsor us. And make sure you're following us on both Twitter and Facebook to get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to the Commander's Quarters Twitter and Facebook can be found in the description. Also in the description below, you'll find a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general tier where you can get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And make sure you check out some of our other videos on budget deck techs, budget staples, and budget top 5 lists. Alright, that's all for me today. Thanks again, and have a good one.